otherwise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and in today's episode I'm pleased to be joined by Cobb. Mr. Cobb is a former federal prosecutor and is currently a partner in the law firm of Hogan Lovells and is widely regarded as one of the leading white-collar lawyers in the country. Mr. Cobb's experience includes representing clients in connection with DOJ and SEC inquiries, including those in the FCPA context. Thanks for joining us today, Ty.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here with the FCPA professor.
Well, today I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that are on one level focused on the SEC's enforcement of the FCPA and some related questions there too. The first question concerns publicly traded companies, which in FCPA speak, I suppose, are called issuers. Issuers are, of course, subject to the DOJ and SEC's jurisdiction on FCPA matters. And indeed, in recent years, many issuer FCPA enforcement actions have been SEC-only enforcement actions, arguably making the SEC, as opposed to the DOJ, perhaps more relevant to publicly traded companies in this space. As many listeners probably know, in April of 2016, the DOJ released what it calls its FCPA Pilot Program, some DOJ policies and procedures concerning voluntary disclosure and cooperation in the FCPA context. This, of course, was a DOJ program only. So the question I have for you, Ty, is do you think the SEC should have, at the same time, or perhaps should in the near future, formally articulate its policy on voluntary disclosure and cooperation issues in the FCPA inquiries like the DOJ has?
I think it's a very important question, Mike, and I think the challenge here is perception, at least from my perspective on the playing field as a practitioner, because if you look at the pilot program, it's not like it's a treatise. It's pretty straightforward. In my view, it's not the sea change that it's purported to be, and there have been historically several iterations of DOJ desires for cooperation generally, and in the FCPA world, and the impact of cooperation on corporate prosecutions. But this is not, as I say, a really extraordinarily detailed set of guidelines. It's pretty straightforward. The SEC, instead of going the route of laying down the rules in the way that DOJ has for how they're going to proceed, typically tries to educate the public through its press releases at the conclusion of a case, whether that be an actual penalty, official condemnation, resulting in official action, or whether it's a DPA or non-prosecution agreement or administrative settlement of some sort. And I think they've become increasingly good at identifying the cooperation factors, remediation factors, and other conduct of the companies involved that leads to whatever leniency, if any, that was provided. Or, let's take the case of Biomed, whose previous agreement with the SEC was extended and rescinded, and there was a perceived breach. I think they're becoming a little bit more transparent to the directors and officers of the world, and certainly the practitioners, about how they do approach these things and what they actually consider. So I don't think there is quite as much difference on the field between the two, but philosophically they definitely take a different approach, and you can't deny that.
Yeah, regarding the pilot program, point taken that there's really nothing new per se in that document. The DOJ has long been encouraging voluntary disclosure in this space, and long been rewarding cooperation, including in ranges below the sentencing guidelines. But it is obviously new in the sense that it's into one document. We now have a title to the program.
No, that's definitely true. And I didn't mean to diminish the significance of it, because it does, under one roof, as you would say, pull in all the considerations that they want the world to know are relevant, and particularly the emphasis on individual responsibility.
So here we are in 2016. The FCPA is clearly not a new statute. It's been with us, very soon. It will be with us for 40 years. But in FCPA history, the SEC is not believed to have ever been put to its burden of proof in an FCPA action by an issuer. There have been a few times in individual FCPA enforcement actions in which the SEC was put to their burden of proof. But there, I think, undisputable statistic is the SEC has never prevailed when put to its ultimate burden of proof, even though that burden of proof in a civil action is obviously not as high as the proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal action. What do you make of these dynamics, these statistics, and from a rule of law perspective, from a public policy perspective, do you think this is a good or acceptable dynamic of SEC, FCPA enforcement?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think those are all valid questions and dynamics to raise, but you're right. The statute has been with us since Stanley Sporkin invented it in the late 70s, and having been on some panels with him in the 80s discussing the evolution and implementation of it, I frankly think he'd be proud of where it is today. The reach has expanded globally. Bribery and corruption is on the front lines of what most governments are fighting at this stage of the game, given the perceived $2.6 trillion annual hit that the economies around the world take from bribery and corruption. So I do think that while 2016 has us in a place that we might not have foreseen 30 years ago or so, that enforcers of the statute have matured quite capably. I think right now, for example, given the cooperation between nations that has been fostered typically with USA leadership and often dragging other countries along grudgingly, there are just enormous cases that are being dealt with. Siemens was a huge case. Petrobras is a huge case. The Panama Papers will probably be the gift that keeps on giving to the SEC and the Justice Department in the near future. And the tools are there to deal with this. And the anti-money laundering tools used by DOJ and the access to foreign investigative and enforcement authorities is, unprecedented. And I think the mechanisms are there to deal with bribery and corruption. If we can keep the world, coming to a philosophical place that the United States elected to go alone in the late 70s, that this is an issue that will be increasingly successfully dealt with.
Yeah, of course, related to foreign law enforcement investigations, as you and your clients, probably well know, for most of the FCPA's history, companies under scrutiny or resolving FCPA enforcement actions, for the most part, only had to worry about the United States government. But as you mentioned, over the last several years, there are other nations that are increasingly taking a greater interest in conduct that is at issue or alleged in FCPA enforcement actions, whether those motives by foreign law enforcement are pure or perhaps motivated by an easy access to settlement money is perhaps an issue for another day. But what is your experience or insight as to maybe the pros and cons, perhaps, of this approach of what has sometimes been called carbon copy enforcement actions by foreign law enforcement agencies or dual investigations?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a great relief to U.S. companies in terms of their ability to compete around the world. I think there was definitely, certainly a decade-long, maybe a two-decade-long period where the inability of U.S. companies to compete, particularly in procurements, because of the possibility that a foreign competitor, could pay a bribe and it would be lawful, whereas in the United States those considerations had been placed out of bounds. I think, as I say, that American businesses, I think, feel reassured that there's a lot less of that. In fact, many of the recent prosecutions and civil actions by both the SEC and the Justice Department have focused on foreign companies. Siemens being an excellent example. Plus, you do have the globalization of bribery and corruption. You can take an issuer, which can include a foreign company whose ADRs are for sale in the United States, and really police the world. The UK has certainly has tried in an expansive way to legislate extraterritorial jurisdiction, and is clearly very serious about reining in corruption with regard to their economy. I think Germany, of course, as well, this year has made major modifications to its legislative matrix that also heighten the bar for corporate conduct and make prosecution of bribery and corruption substantially easier. So I think you've got countries like that who clearly are serious, I believe, in terms of taking action. Then you've got countries in South America, you've got China, you've got East Africa, where there's reason to be suspect about whether the recent legislative initiatives are in fact going to be enforced or going to be enforced fairly rather than politically. But at least, they have new laws on the books and are taking action. I think China is at a leadership level serious about trying to deal with corruption, but at a practical level faces just untold difficulties. They're a long way, of course, from the old days where the saying there was the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And they have rolled out regionally enforcement and corruption deterrence. So I think the world's changing fast. It's changing faster and more seriously in some places than others, but it is changing, and the number of countries with anti-bribery provisions in their enforcement arsenal has grown exponentially in the last 15 years since the late 90s signing of the OECD.
And, it's very popular, or so it seems, to compare U.S. enforcement of the FCPA to foreign law enforcement of their FCPA-like laws, and this is largely for the listeners' benefit. In many cases, that comparison is sort of an apples to oranges type comparison. Among other reasons, many OECD countries have really no concept of corporate criminal liability, or even if they do, it's only like so-called controlling minds or high-level executives can expose the company to criminal liability. And furthermore, let's face it, the vast majority of corporate FCPA enforcement actions are resolved through alternative resolution vehicles that, simply don't exist in the vast majority of other OECD countries, with the exception of the UK, which has recently adopted DPAs. Any comments on that sort of dynamic and what perhaps may represent the best or better approach?
No, I think you're absolutely right on that. For example, in Brazil, there really is not a concept of corporate criminal liability, but they, as they are actively demonstrating daily in the Petrobras and related investigations, taking, firm and decisive action against individuals, including, current and former government officials. I think that you see a lot more individual prosecutions and enforcement actions in the rest of the world than you do in the United States. And, that would, I think, prove your point that it really is not an apples-to-apples comparison, because I would venture to guess probably 80% of the cases in the United States over the last 8 to 10 years have involved corporations and not individuals. And I think in the last 15 years or so, under the OECD countries, they're less than 25% of the cases involve corporations, and the vast majority involve individuals. I'm not sure that necessarily, though, diminishes the deterrent effect of the laws that are in place around the world, and it certainly doesn't diminish the expanding cooperation of the international enforcement communities. The federal police in Brazil, the SFO in the UK, and the SEC and the DOJ here, all work closely together, as do many other countries around the world.
And my final question is sort of a big picture question. As I mentioned earlier, very soon the FCPA will turn 40, and it's beyond dispute that the compliance commitments and compliance best practices across the business landscape are more robust in the last 10 years than they were, in prior decades under the FCPA. But on one level, it's also undisputed that we have more FCPA enforcement now than we ever have had. We do have more companies under FCPA scrutiny now than perhaps we ever have had. And the question is, does that represent success in terms of what the FCPA was designed to accomplish?
Yeah, and I think that's, a question you could argue both sides of with knowledgeable, practitioners, academicians, and executives in the United States. But from my own perspective, I think that it does represent success. I think a substantial number of current FCPA investigations in the United States are the product of voluntary disclosures. And the process that led to voluntary disclosures is the maturation of the statute, both in the Justice Department and the SEC, but also in the boardrooms of the country. You've got the old Caremark standard of having to have a strong strong compliance program that's enforced. You've got Sarbanes-Oxley that requires the same thing, all the way up through the most recent pilot program announcement and the Yates memo. I think if you look at the continuum over time of how the burden has been placed back on corporations to self-police and disclose, and the fact that there are a lot of disclosures and thus more cases, I think you could, draw a pretty good line that ends with a decision that it has been successful in accomplishing exactly what was intended. Clearly, there's more to do. I think we're lucky in the United States, frankly, that most of the people involved in the enforcement of the statute are indeed experienced, intelligent, honorable, hardworking people eager to define and then maintain a standard. I think this statute is enforced in a way that is arguably more consistent and easier to understand than, for example, the FCA, False Claims Act cases, where the government is often accused, and sometimes rightly so, of looking at various industries, healthcare industry, banks, government contractors as sources of revenue rather than resolving all the cases in a way that looks consistent to the outside observer.
Yeah, I mean, with the False Claims Act, and, let's just maybe pick another statute. There's many others that are business organizations are subject to, whether it's the antitrust laws or, like you mentioned, the False Claims Act. A bit of a retort on that point is that those statutes are all being enforced against the framework of multiple Supreme Court decisions framing the parameters of that statute, not to mention, probably in aggregate hundreds of appellate court decisions, framing the outer contours of that statute. That's obviously, for the most part, not the case. Yes, there might be one appellate court decision on one particular element, but do you think that's a distinguishing factor when it comes to FCPA enforcement, and if so, a problematic distinguishing factor?
I think that is a very significant distinguishing factor. I think, again, there's sort of two sides of that coin. The False Claims Act has gotten to the point where the penalties are so extreme that more companies and more individuals are challenging the act in court and doing so successfully. Certainly, as you point out, the parameters of the statute of limitations, for example, whether the funds involved are truly government funds, what the statutes of limitation are or should be, and how they should be interpreted, and whether there can be continuing violations, and whether the conduct involved is actually prohibited conduct under the statute or simply a legitimate business activity. All those things have been addressed by the numerous decisions that you suggest, whereas in the FCPA world, that has not been the case. Now, you can argue that that's a product of a series of arguably rational resolutions, either administratively, non-prosecution, deferred prosecution, or settlements, that have prevented a lot of these cases from being forced to trial, where you have the government arguably overreaching in the FCA world. There doesn't seem to be quite as much of that, although it certainly has occurred in the FCPA world.
Well, thanks for spending time with our listeners today. Ty Cobb is certainly a veteran of the white-collar bar, has been practicing his craft for a long time, and has some insight and experience on these issues that I hope listeners found informative. So thanks again, Ty.
Well, thank you, Mike. I really enjoyed it.